All right, should we get started? It's just about exactly on time. Thank you for coming. I'm super glad that you are here. My name is Kitty Kolding. I'm the CEO of a company called Chrysalis Partners. I'm going to apologize right now for my lack of shoes because I can't wear them for one more moment. Before we dive in, I want to tell you that what I'm talking to you about today is not technology. It's not a platform. It isn't an algorithm or software. It's a methodology for engaging users who have been traditionally difficult to engage with data. That's really what we do. What we're going to talk about is some things that we've identified as we work with corporate partners, corporate clients in the analytics space, but also, interestingly, a similar set of dynamics in the smart cities world, which is kind of strange. But what we see is, in both cases, an enormous amount of data that is available to folks across these places, and far too little of it is being consumed and used and creating benefit. Particularly by those people who are not engineers or analysts or technologists. And so my goal is to share some insights about what we found, some solutions that we created, and hope that there's some good insights for you here. To sort of set the playing field, we have to talk about what's really happening in the world today. So Deloitte did a study recently, just a couple months ago. 67% of pretty senior and mid-level people that were surveyed said they are not comfortable with the tools they have to access data today. 76% of those people said they had, however, increased their analytical maturity. So this is an improvement. And most, 62%, are still using spreadsheets primarily. That is not a good statement about what's happening with our tools. Even at companies that have exceptionally strong sort of data-driven cultures, you're still seeing almost 40% that are uncomfortable. And yet there is ample evidence that by being data-driven, you are more successful as an organization and as an individual. So it's clear when we talk to chief data officers, CIOs, analytics folks, they are very serious about creating a data-driven culture. They're actively working on this. They're spending real money and staff on this. They're doing all the right things with the data. They're implementing the right tools. The tools are bubbling up insights. They've created, in many cases, a shared vocabulary for data across the organization so that everyone knows what they mean when they're talking about these topics, which is really good. And the data is getting democratized. It's being made available to everyone who needs it. So the tools are there. They're good tools. They're being implemented properly, and no one is using them. We think this is a last mile problem, that there's this huge gap between this incredible sort of center of excellence around analytics and the end users, the people that are not in the analytics or the BI team, people that are in other places in the organization that need and can dramatically benefit from the data but aren't for a variety of reasons. So that's where we spend our time, is in that gap, in that last mile section. We found at a very high level a couple of quick insights. One, there needed to be a different engagement approach. And so we'll talk to you about what that looks like. And that at first, at least, the right thing to do is to engage with these people outside the dashboard. Step away for a little while from the dashboard to go get these people and engage them. In short, there needs to be a few extra steps to sort of get these folks rolling, get them into the swing of things, and stimulate them to start using those tools. But it seems difficult to do without some extra activities. So our solution is what we call humanizing data. And for us, that definition is transforming complexity, transforming data and analytics into a form that speaks to human beings, is much more easily consumed and digested, and in particular by people that are not analysts or engineers or scientists or technologists, the people that are sort of already in that mode. What we see humanizing data, the outcomes, the kinds of things that happen when organizations focus on humanizing data is, as mentioned, the data gets consumed more readily and more fully. It makes the data more approachable. It creates an entirely different level of relevance, which is critical. And it's pointedly connected to a user's success, which is all about that relevance. It's connected to individuals' attitudes and perspectives, the point of view that they have as an employee in the organization. It's available often either more quickly or in a more convenient fashion, and it's shareable. This is, you can't spread this ideology of being data-driven if at a grassroots level people are not sharing. So you need to make it shareable. So we're just gonna run through the steps. This usually takes us a full day to do this, so I'm gonna race through this so that we're not taking a full day. But at a high level, we've sort of chunked it up into these pieces. So I'm gonna talk you through each of those pieces quickly. The very first thing that we always do and recommend that clients do is to do an audience study. And so what that's saying is, who are the people that are not using your tools, that are not engaging with data? Go talk to them. You want to ask them and learn about their learning styles, what their workflow consists of, what tools they are using, and what tools are available to them. Things like the sorts of pressures that they're dealing with that data can either help with or exacerbate, their appetites for complexity and their openness to data and analytics. We also want to look at their work environment. Are they working from home? Are they working in a big open office environment? Are they execs and they're in more of a sort of cloistered office space? And where does that group fit organizationally within the company? That becomes a really important driver sometimes, or a deterrent for their likelihood to consume and get really active with data if certain dynamics within a company can create a real problem given an organizational structure. The next step is a data review. So we then spend some time saying, well, what data is available to these people? What are they already seeing? What do they already have access to? What are they consuming? What are they not consuming? And which data streams are actually highly relevant right now to their success? Which of those pieces can make these people more successful? Whatever their objectives are, if they're in sales, if they're in ops, if they're in finance, what are the pieces that would really unleash some value? Let's start there and help these people win as quickly as possible. We also want to look at the nature of the data. Is it sort of spewing forth constantly, as we see in smart city environments, where there's just a colossal amount of data shooting into these analytics platforms, and it's really hard to get your arms around. Is it incredibly deep and dense? What's the nature of the data that they're able to consume? And then what are their tools? Because they may have some very primitive but very effective tools, and that's an important thing for you to know. They may have some very sophisticated tools, but they simply haven't gotten comfortable with them yet, which we saw in that Deloitte survey, that's a very, very common issue, is a lack of comfort with the tools. So we're trying to create that comfort, stimulate that engagement. The next step is extracting the data. We're going to make some choices for them, for these folks who have had a bit of trouble, they haven't gotten engaged. We're going to make some choices. What's the right data, as I mentioned, that's going to help them be successful? And what should we put aside for now? What should we go back for later in a different iteration of this kind of work? Given what we have, what we're left with, the data we've chosen to work with, how do we frame this in a way that helps tell a set of stories? And we're going to talk about storytelling a lot more in a minute, but what are the storylines that you want to sort of present? What are the, think of sort of parallel paths of topics that are important for these folks to be consuming regularly? And it's going to depend on their role, but that's important to sort of sketch out what the storylines might look like. And then, what is it that you actually want them to do with this data? Are you trying to add a new behavior? Are you trying to get them to stop doing something? Are you trying to make them think about something between steps 2 and 3? What is it that you want to accomplish here? You have to have really assert your intention around this in order for this to turn out the way that you want. Later, when these people are comfortable and more skilled, they'll start to iterate on these things on their own. But for right now, you're doing this for them for a reason. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about visualizing. I'm pretty sure everyone in this room knows how to visualize data. You're probably much better at it than I am. But visualization can go haywire, as we all know. Sometimes we fall madly in love with our data, and it's too much. We've got to reel it in a little bit. And that's almost always the case when you're dealing with people that really are not super into data. So all I'm really going to talk to you about here is a few sort of guardrails, best practices, things that you just have to keep reminding yourself about. Because even really good visualizers sometimes wander off a little bit, we've seen. We know that clutter is our enemy. We know that we need to reduce clutter we have to eradicate it as much as possible. It's tempting to load it up. You want to show everything because there's so many interesting things happening. You've got to resist it. Color. We convey emotion automatically by the colors that we select. And you can be an incredibly well-studied person on this topic, but you don't have to be. There's a bunch of really great tools like this one that will give you a very quick snapshot of here's what these colors mean, here's when you should be using them, that you can put into your perspective when you're creating materials. And it goes for lots of different things, not just charts and graphs and tables, but if your focus is recreating your corporate color palette, that's not the right focus. Your goal should be to communicate wordlessly using color. Obviously, contrast is an effortless way to create emphasis, to create a focal point, especially when you've got a lot of data moving around or just sitting in a static way. It's incredibly important to explain to the user what you want them to look at. Direct their attention where you want it to go. I'm a labels person. I really like labels, but it's too much a lot of times. There's too many labels sometimes, and it tends to distract. You start calculating and you start sizing with your eyes, and then you've got your grid lines, and then things all of a sudden have gotten really haywire. Now, it's not very easy to consume this. So definitely want to avoid label excess. Tables. I like a good table as much as the next guy, but you can make tables much more difficult to consume if you've got a whole bunch of borders, if they're thick borders, if they're varying borders, and you can make a table, which is a very powerful way to communicate a lot of data, far more valuable if you're using a heat map behind it instead of tons of tiny little numbers that really distract, cause a bunch of processing, your user to do a bunch of processing that you don't really want them to spend time on. What you want them to do is get the idea of what the data is saying, not spend all of their time trying to understand it. Okay, I know pie charts are the devil. I know that. This is what has been beaten into my head for a very long time. But, you know, sometimes pie charts are helpful. However, 3D pie charts are real bad. They really distort your vision in a way. They make it hard for your head to get wrapped around their proportions. It's just the nature of the way that ends up working. So this is just meant to say, this is more of a comparison. I'm not saying the bottom is better, but I am saying 3D pies can trick your eye into thinking something that isn't real, especially if you're not using labels. So be very careful with that. This is super interesting to me. You know, I see people using diagonal or rotated text all the time. And it seems like an excellent solution if you've got a long sort of axis label and you're trying to, you know, you have to figure out some way to handle all of that text. But it's incredibly important that you understand you are putting up a huge speed bump in your viewer's ability to consume that data. 45-degree rotation is slowing things down by 52%, and a 90-degree is 205%. You're making it way harder for them to consume what's in that. And you should be making it easier. That's your job. Obviously, size your chart type to the size, the space that you have. And we're going to talk about this a bit more when we talk about finished deliverables. You obviously want to take advantage of what you have and keep playing around with different chart sizes, et cetera, to maximize. There's something called pre-attentive attributes in the world. And these are basically processing that takes place in your sensory memory. And it requires no conscious effort from the user for this sort of pre-attentive processing. It's essentially automated, and it takes less than 500 milliseconds to complete one of these pre-attentive processing rounds. The 4 pre-attentive attributes are color, form, movement, and spatial positioning. So these are tools you can use to create emphasis. And your goal is to save the user from having to perform a visual search so that they're not chunking through what you have and trying to understand what it means and spending time and burning calories. And it starts to create a level of frustration over time, especially if it's difficult or it's new or there's a ton of complexity. You just want to take the difficulty out of that as much as possible. And then we have this thing called extraneous cognitive load, which is a sciencey sort of a term, but it basically is looking at your working memory resources. So what we're doing here is trying to optimize your working memory resources. Intrinsic cognitive load is sort of baked in. It's there sort of no matter what you do. Extraneous cognitive load is essentially distracting information that makes a task more complex than it needs to be from a consumer point of view. And germane cognitive load is a mechanism essentially to help you learn new skills and take in new information. So too much information on a page makes it more difficult for you to learn and take in that information. So you want to stay away from those excesses. And the ways you do that are you're simplifying, you're decluttering, you're emphasizing 1 or 2 points and not 10. And you're focusing on explanatory and not exploratory. Exploratory is the sausage making. You don't want to show the sausage making. That's not what you're doing. You could show them a very nice sausage, but not all the things that you did to get to the sausage. And we see that happening all the time because it's really interesting and cool. Sometimes the inspirations that led up to where you ended up, it's very interesting, but often it's only interesting to you. What these people are looking for is, you know, what's the outcome here? What am I supposed to do with this? So the next piece, we're just going to talk through a few aspects of telling a data story. Yesterday, Zach from Juice Analytics just did a masterful job of looking at data storytelling, particularly in an interactive environment. It was fabulous. You should rewatch his session if you didn't get to see it. But it's incredibly important to seat what someone is learning by putting it into a narrative, into a story form. So using words, human beings using words that complement learning and explanations and put things in context, that's what this is about. So there are a few really good ways to reliably tell a story. And the 3 acts approach is one of them. So you've got sort of a beginning, middle, and end. You have some very specific things that you're going through. You've got a setup, a conflict, and a resolution that you're working somebody through. You know, you don't have to tell a fanciful story, but you do have to have those elements. The art of storytelling is ancient and proven, and so take advantage of what exists. You know, at first you're setting the stage and identifying what's going on, what the imbalance is that you're seeking to address. Next, you're putting the problem in context, creating some relevance. Giving examples is really important, and showing what happens if you do nothing can often be a very important story point. And you're making sure the audience understands their role in the solution. You're sort of transferring some of this and saying, look, you have a part to play here, and that becomes really important in terms of relevance. And then at the end, you don't want to miss a call to action and a set of suggested solutions. And again, that here's how you can help approach, super important. A couple other just side note things about telling a story. Powerful pairings, you know, bringing together ideas and emotions. Here's a concept, here's how it makes us feel. That seats a learning with a human being. That's important. The attention and energy is about what's the impetus behind all this? What's going on? Where is this heading? And then obviously, great visuals and narrative combined so that they are cohesive and they feel and look right together. And hooks. Hooks are super important. You know, you can set up a semi-dramatic clash of forces. You can present a couple of opposites that are perhaps surprising to see together, to see them in the same space, interacting on the same problem or opportunity. A really useful way to do it. Showing balance and imbalance, what it looks like when things are working properly, what's happening when they are not, and really showing those pieces very dramatically. And finally, this is probably the most, if I can get one thing across to you today, it's about language. Obviously, you want to tell this story from the point of view of your audience, who you now understand really well because you've done this audience study. You want to be sure that it's taking their perspective, not a sort of generic company-wide perspective, but how does this affect sales? How is ops going to do better as a result of this? Obviously, that's important. And this idea of terminology and vernacular. So we talk sometimes about how most of you in this room may be native English speakers. And you may have learned or have the ability to learn multiple other languages and speak them beautifully, fluently. You may be fully immersed in those languages. But at night, when you go home and you're with your friends or your family, you're speaking your native language, in this case, perhaps English. So when an organization creates a shared vocabulary around data and analytics, that's a good thing. But when you're also forcing people to use that language and only that language, you're losing an opportunity to connect with these people. So it's good to have the shared language, but it's really good to translate back to the native language. We know in an organization, sales speaks about the business entirely differently than do the ops people, than do the finance people. It's remarkable how different the terminology and the jargon is. And so that's an area that when you're doing your audience study, you really want to tune into the terms that they use. And you're almost making a map, equating them, so that you're not losing them. They're not having to stop and say, wait, what does that mean again? I know I had the shared vocabulary quiz, but I can't remember. So you want to try to avoid that. Speak in their language, their terminology, whenever possible. And then obviously, if you can, especially if you have a knack for it, create some repeatable sound bites. That's what's going to socialize this information, these behaviors, the things that you're trying to get them to emulate and repeat and propagate. So when we do this work, help clients do it or teach them to do it themselves, there's a whole phase of this that is about creating a set of finished deliverables. So you've understood who you're dealing with and you've looked at the data, you've created some really impactful visualizations, you've written a cool narrative, and now it's time to put it in front of them. And you need to give at least as much attention to what that deliverable, how it works, what it looks like, how it's formed, as anything else that you've tried. Because you're the same way, we're all the same way. When you see something, you have an immediate flash of what it is, whether it's appealing to you, whether you're like, I don't know what that is, oh, I'm compelled by this, I want to look further, or, I gotta go. So we give a lot of thought to wrapping this up. We call it putting it in a container, but it's a matter of creating a polished package so that what you've done gets put in the hands of your users in a nice, neat, tidy, effective format. So a few, again, guardrails to think about when you're creating these things. Your eye naturally works in a Z pattern as it moves down a page. So take advantage of that. Position the most important content top left. Let the story and the journey flow in a Z pattern down the rest of the page. So someone's naturally moving through the material and you're not causing them to jump around in a way that feels jangly to them when they're experiencing it. So it's sort of creating a visual journey of the material. Great designers, of which I am very much not one, think about things like Gestalt, right? And so these are principles, they're theories about how human beings perceive the world around them. A bunch of German psychologists came up with these principles almost 100 years ago, but they have endured, and they are really the foundation for many designers. And you can think about sort of marketing people, but also think about great UI for interactive tools and websites and whatever it might be. The best designers focus on these principles. So I'm going to quickly run you through what these mean, because anybody can incorporate this kind of thinking. You don't have to be a designer at Apple to to use these principles at all. So the first two, closure and continuity. So closure, your eye naturally closes up sections that are missing. You don't even think about it, it just happens. And there are a bunch of reasons why people use these approaches, but it's important to understand that you will do that sort of involuntarily, it just happens. Continuity is a really beautiful thing to incorporate. The Girl Scouts logo there, you see these three faces sort of flowing, but look at the flow of Coca-Cola, the way your eye just moves right along with the way that it's displayed. That is a wonderful example of the Gestalt of continuity. Okay, this idea of uniform connectedness. So it's one of the strongest principles, and it refers to the fact that elements that are connected by uniform visual properties are perceived as being more related than those not connected. So these seem very differently connected than these. These guys, something's happening with them. I don't know what's happening with them, but these are different. So little tiny things that you can do to get your reader to understand exactly what you want them to look at and what the relationship is between the parts that you may be presenting. Proximity is interesting because it overpowers other signals of distinction. So you see here, these are two groups, two different sets of colors, but we understand that these are more related than are the brown circles. They have a different relationship together because of the way that proximity works, because they're separated into two groups. Similarity, these guys up at the top, they're the exact same shape. They are organized entirely uniformly, but you see a difference because they're colored differently. So you create a similarity for each column, even though there's no other difference between those shapes. And then enclosure, which happens to be one of my favorites, particularly when you're looking at a lot of rich, complex data. At the bottom there, where you see that red rectangle, those are different shapes, different colors, two blocks, two groups, and yet you have identified instantly that those four at the bottom have something to do with one another. And so if you're trying to tell a data story, that's a great way to connect what you're seeing with what you're saying. So, and then there's that extraneous cognitive load thing. You know, walls of gray text, complicated, lots of things happening. It just makes you, want to look away. And then, as I mentioned, you're trying to put it all together, trying to put it in a container or a package or a polished deliverable that you can provide to your audiences. You got to get the length right. Are these people with short attention spans? They need something really brief that fits on their phone screen. They're going to consume it, they're going to understand it, they're going to swipe it away. That's one set of users. There are others that want a contemplated presentation. It might be slides or a report in a PDF. The medium has to be right. So maybe they want pieces of paper. That's totally fine, especially at first when you're trying to get them, especially if they'll carry it around with them and read it on the train or at home while they're watching TV. That's a good thing. So don't divorce yourself from the idea of a paper deliverable. And I strongly suggest, I guarantee every one of you has access to some pretty skilled marketing and design people. It's just that they focus on product and sales. Grab a hold of them for a little while and have them help you with your data deliverables. Have them help create maybe some templates or some design principles that you guys work out together so that you have a baseline, so that everybody starts using these things. Maybe you have an agency that can be valuable in this process, but go ask those resources to enlist their help. And just get this format and length and density right when you're delivering your final materials. And just a few quick reminders, there is such a thing as first look recoil, closely related to extraneous cognitive load, where you look at something and say, oh, I'm not going to look at that right now. I am not ready for this. I haven't had enough coffee, whatever it is. But this is all about what we've already said. Simplicity, clarity, no clutter, white space. White space acts like a pause in a conversation, so you got to use it. We talked about bite-sized pieces. Repeatable sound bites are super important. There's something called affordances, and affordances are clues about how an object should be used. So a button is meant to be pushed, and a knob is meant to be turned. We just know this automatically. When you use those things, you've helped someone move right through what they're supposed to be doing. So take advantage of affordances. We know there's different kinds of learners, visual and verbal, and, lots of things to think about after you've spoken to your audience. Put your reader's attention where you want it. Be very deliberate about that. And remember, not all data is needed. Make some choices. Cull it down. Distill it to the most critical components that are there. Okay. One of the most powerful insights that we have come across in our work is that learners who are not already analysts are not going to come searching around for your data. They're not going to dig around in your dashboards. They're not going to do it. That doesn't mean the data is bad, it isn't. And it doesn't mean the dashboard is bad. They aren't. They're typically great. But it's hard. It's hard for people to transition into that when that has not been their deal. So we always say, if you build it, I'm pretty sure they're not going to come. So don't expect that. Start with a different expectation. Assume you need to push this material to your users, at least at first. Create a distribution, a delivery plan, which we'll talk about in a second, that puts what you've created, the data you want them to understand and utilize, put it right in their hands at the right time, in a place that's convenient that you've already understood because you did your audience study, and that is nicely in sync with their workflows, their schedules, their deadlines, their quarterly machinations, whatever it is that they're adhering to. You're going to sync up with that instead of expecting them to sync up with you. If you can get that, if you can stimulate that, you do start to bring them back to your tools eventually. But this push, not pull thing is super duper important at the beginning, and it makes a dramatic difference in engagement for folks that are typically not engaged. Delivery plan is typically about a schedule, when, time of day, day of week, period, in month or quarter or whatever that looks like. How are those prioritized so that the most important ones have priority and other things can be a little more unnecessary if they have to be. The deliverables format we've talked about, make sure it's showing up in the right way, and then that channel, whether it's email or paper or something that's going to show up on their phone, some web-based knowledge location, put it there if that's where they spend time. And finally, keep in mind that you are building a relationship with these people. This is not a one and done kind of thing. Think about it the way you would think about if you got a puppy. You would not take your adorable, precious little puppy. I just got 2 puppies for no good reason. So this is very current for me. Except they were rescues and they were so cute and we had to have them. But this is an exercise in ongoing care and feeding, right? These relationships that you're developing with these people, you're trying to pull them into being data-driven. You're trying to make that really interesting, and that's about a two-way communication. It's ongoing, it evolves over time, and you have to think about it as something you're really committed to. It's a devotion of sorts. And finally, you're asking for feedback. Accept that what you create is probably never going to be right or perfect. You can make it better, though. You can make it better on every iteration. Every single version of this that you do can be a little bit better, but it gets that way if you ask. If you say, what did you think of this? How did this work for you? What else should we be doing? What's a better way to approach this? Are we missing anything that we should have covered, but we didn't? Super important for you to be content with this idea that your goal is just to get better as you go. Okay. To wrap up, these are sort of the steps that we just went through. You're starting by humanizing. This is not about software. It's about engagement with other humans that need to obtain the value you can give them. But you have to make it work a little bit differently for them to get it. You're going to start with that audience study that's going to look deeply into the who and the how and where and what, really understand the nature of those people. And they might be 5 different groups. Your ops people might have a totally different set of requirements than your salespeople and your customer support people and some of your finance users. You might have to think about this in 5 completely different flavors. And our suggestion is do that. Because if you can get everybody working, there starts to be coherence after a while. Those streams start to come together at some point, but for a little while, except it's going to be a little inefficient. It's going to be a little extra work. But you got to get there. You got to get them there. Otherwise, what's the alternative? They're just not going to use it? People are going to get fired because they're not using the material? That's not right. This is a matter of getting it into their hands and getting them interested so that everyone is successful. You're going to curate the hell out of that data and make sure you are not putting an avalanche of stuff on their heads because it will not work, and you're shooting yourself in the foot, and you're certainly not helping them. Very thoughtful about your visualizations, very thoughtful about your narrative, all the tools you can use to create a great narrative. You want to design your materials, your finished materials, around their interests, their attitudes, their appetite for complexity and depth. Each of them is going to work differently depending on who that is. And you're going to deliver. You're going to hand it to them. You're going to make sure they get it. You are not going to post it somewhere and hope they come and look at it, because they're not going to come. And then remember that iterating, that engagement with marketing, with the people that can help you, that do this all day long. So this is what they do all day long, is think about this stuff. Take advantage of those people. And keep asking for more feedback. Make it better and better and better. These are some people that we honor and think a lot about. Many intersect with some of the folks that you cited yesterday, Zach. And Zach himself is one of them, because we read his work and see what he does all the time and are always hugely impressed. But read up on some of this stuff. It's really interesting once you get into it a little bit. Some of this will be more interesting than others, but there's a huge wealth of knowledge out there that can make you better at this if you choose to dig around a bit. Questions? Wow. Sure. This one?
How do you feel about all tasks on a dashboard?
I think that can be an excellent way to bring together a lot of information and let a user self-discover, go to the right places. It's a nice way to chunk things up so that someone's not scrolling and scrolling. It can be very effective. It just all has to conform to the same set of guidelines so that it feels cohesive together. Sometimes we see multi-tabs, and each one of them is so different that it's a little bit disorienting. So we would suggest not doing that.
Or would you advise them more about figuring it out, like some things are paper, some things are emails, some things are presentations, which kind of gels more?
Well, you have to attend to, so the question is, if you already have a sort of destination for your analytics materials, should you keep centered on that? And look, it's probably a corporate mandate that you do that. So I definitely don't want you to get in trouble. But think about creating breadcrumbs toward that. And so if that's ultimately what you're trying to stimulate, is getting them to go there more often and to consult that area when they're going to do something, when they're considering a decision in between different activities, then our recommendation is go to them first and start giving them those materials and make it easy for them to click or go to this place where there's more. But definitely employ this breadcrumbs approach that gives them a set of steps to head in that direction instead of expecting them to sort of do a hard cutover and go there and only there, especially for people you've been trying to engage and it's just not working, they're not going there. That's what we see working is, and testing, I mean, maybe paper is the right thing, or maybe it's sending them a quick email with an excerpt and a link so that they, go there themselves to do further exploration.
I'm very interested in the pushing technique that you suggested. Do you have any extreme examples of things you suggested around going to push content and make sure that the audience is actually seeing the data?
So he's asking about extreme examples of pushing the data. The ones that I find the most fascinating are in the smart city environment. So what we see there is, all these systems shooting all this data into pretty cool analytics dashboards and tools that are capturing, sensor data and just gigantic quantities of data. And, it might be traffic information so there's a traffic engineer who's really happy because he suddenly got stuff in front of him that he's been wanting to get his hands on for a long time. So that's really good. But a couple layers out from the traffic engineer is like the mayor and the city manager and the city council members. And let me tell you, they are not looking at what the traffic engineer is looking at. And it wasn't made for them. That material was not created for them. And their vantage point is many systems, not just what's going on with the signal safety at intersections, right? They're zoomed way out and they're looking at a whole other array of topics around spend and engagement and utility and ROI and all those kinds of things. So the most extreme ones that I ever see are in that scenario. They almost always want paper, which is great. And they want us to harmonize multiple data streams because it all does roll up to a set of decisions that they have to make, trade-offs. Cities don't have a lot of money. These systems cost money. So how are they going to decide which ones to roll out, which ones to leave in pilot mode? And there's a bunch of things to think about there. And those are the ones where this orchestration of a ton of data and just slicing it so far back to make it consumable by somebody that is not interested in those sorts of data elements, that's the toughest one, and then literally turning it into pieces of paper. Yeah.
I just would like a copy.
Sure. The conference makes them available, yeah?
We've collected all the presentations and made them available.
Okay. If you want to give me your card, I'll just come up and I'll email it to you. Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
In terms of training yourself, as you said, it's so important not to show someone how the sausage is made. If you're using the idea of the Zoom, are there certain questions you ask yourself or a way to kind of make your thinking more rigorous so you know you're zooming in the right level to get a lot of detail, or you're zooming up and out and maybe that person who's at a more senior level?
Yeah. It really does depend on the situation, but the questions are often around, you know, is this exploration of data supportive of an outcome, of a decision? Is this decision ready, or is this a lead up to how I found this number? And that's an easy way to distinguish the two, because the latter is the sausage making, is the steps you took, which might be super interesting to certain people, but for people, especially executives, they don't care. They want to know what the outcome is. What am I supposed to learn about this? How do I make a decision based on what you've given me? So that's I think the easiest way to think about it. Yeah.
So this is focused on builder immunity insights based on reports of the event. How do you see these principles kind of zooming out and applying to rolling out a new reporting platform? So if you're migrating to a new platform and just introducing another one on the side, how do you see these principles kind of applying to that space as well?
I would generally say, there's a bunch of things that jump into my head when you ask that, but I would generally say that, again, slicing this up by audience is what's most important. You probably have a priority of who needs to see this new platform first and who needs to be the biggest user. So, you know, I'm a proponent of quick wins. Start there, go to them, and understand what it is that they would be most valuable for them to understand about this. And then you can sort of port that learning to other groups, and you're going to tweak it a little bit as you get to some of the other groups, but you'll also build on what you learned from that most critical. But I would say start with the most critical users first and spend a bunch of time there getting your foundation, what they like, what they don't like. Maybe we need a little work on some of these things, or maybe this really isn't being explained very well, training isn't quite right, whatever it might be.
Are there any best practices for converting existing dashboards that you send out every day or every week to a dashboard that's either can go self-serving?
Yes. Although I bet you Zach is better at that than I am right at this moment. We ourselves don't build a lot of dashboards. We can, but we typically find that our clients are building pretty great dashboards, and the dashboard is not the problem. But I do think the journey idea, you know, when you think about taking someone through a process of learning what's going on, why it's important, how they can affect it, what the outcomes and actions could be, and why it's good for them. Those things tend to be baked into the idea, so it's a matter of letting that sort of show up on a dashboard. Sometimes dashboards get really antiseptic and they're sort of so clinical that they lose the thread of kind of emotion and interest and flow. And that's one of the things that we hear people say when they're not using tools is, you know, this isn't doing anything for me. And so it's a little bit about cosmetics, but it's mostly about composition and flow of the material. All right, well, I went too fast, but now you have some extra time. Okay, thank you.